Hey guys, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Fetter Homes and Jardin. I'm your host, Lexi Newhouse. In today's episode, we'll explore this idea of the American voice in relation to being unhomed. For starters, I went out into the field to collect a few interviews of what home means to other people.
Home means somewhere where we can stay and be happy. I don't think it's as much of a place specifically as it is of an idea.
I think home is where you're surrounded by the people you love, and just really comfortable and safe.
All right, home to me is probably where I have my friends and family.
So as you heard, everyone gave pretty personal responses. Some were quite general, but overall it was their personal voice. So let's take a second and zoom out to the bigger picture. America's voice and what home means to America. What comes to mind?
I'm the home of the brave.
We like to think that, America is a home in itself. It's a community. It's a shelter. At least that's what we like to dream. And I believe that it's important that I go ahead and preface the difference between the American dream and the American voice. That dream is that idolized hope, the beforehand, whereas I see the voice as being more of the true spirit, the after the fact. The dream of being homed, per se, is paradoxical to the voice of being unhomed. So as people had weighed in describing home as being connected and freeing and accepting, unhomed is just simply the opposite. It's this fragmented and alienating and uncomfortable feeling. And throughout history and literature, this voice reappears not only, following the creation of the national anthem in 1814, but before it. Although America has shared and will continue to share this voice, our motivations to feeling unhomed differs, something that we'll investigate over 6 eras of American literature. Colonialism. Anne Bradstreet, Upon the Burning of Our House. In this era, we see the emergence of the captivity narrative as European settlers begin to displace the Native American and initiate this cultural clash. To quote Bolesco, the idea of the Great Migration, the resettlement of large numbers of Puritan immigrants from the Old to the New World, was born in 1629. The Puritans believed to have been, quote, assigned a special place in God's plan of human history. So not only do we observe this idea of being physically displaced with the new colonist migration and the Native Americans' removal, Anne Bradstreet further builds on this by being both physically and mentally unhomed, especially in her work Upon the Burning of Her House. She depicts her burning house as her dwelling place, quote unquote, bringing up that idea to dwell versus to live. Her struggle with religious conviction is evident as she searches for the value in God's love opposed to her physical possessions, where her self-indulgence into her relationship with her children and her husband is just something that was frowned upon as a Puritan. So this fragmentation and the uncomfortableness she experiences from both being physically removed from her home and her inability to control her emotions by her will represent those unhomed ideals motivated by the struggle of being a good Puritan versus a self-indulging mother and wife.
I'll be so glad when the sun goes down.
Reason and Revolution. Equano, the interesting narrative.
The sun go down. When the sun go down.
Equano purposely crafts his verisimilitude or truth-like narrative around his voyage from the Igbo village near the Niger River in West Africa versus, in reality, being already born into slavery on a plantation in South Carolina, stating in the preface that, quote, "By the horrors of the trade, I was first torn away from all the tender connections that were naturally dear to my heart," end quote. The harshness of his described voyage forces his target audience of pro-slave Americans and Europeans to think about things that motivate them to feel uncomfortable, to put themselves in slaves' shoes, to experience that displacement and ultimately reconsider the ethics or lack thereof of slavery. With it being the era of reason and revolution, appearing to the reason and logic by building the logos, the ethos, the pathos through his journey is what allows him to emphasize that unhomed experience to others, where people ordinarily dream, the American dream as being freeing, that the idea of the self-made man, and yet we see this constricting and alienating side. Romanticism. Edgar Allan Poe. The Fall of the House of Usher. So this era is where we really begin to witness the variety of complex motivations behind feeling unhomed, since Romanticism builds on the idea that, quote, the self is the center, end quote, with the internal perspective of the American self versus the personal self. And Poe specifically focused on the psychology of the unstable sense of self, thus drawing that connection between being unstable, unbalanced, uncertain, and ultimately unhomed through his trajectory and unique and single effect. The Fall reveals that deconstruction of the home, despite our attempts to fit ourselves into said structures, to connect to our past history, and to cope with the end of our bloodline, aka the main character's motivation. And Poe draws this metaphor with the fall of the house representing the crumbling intellect of the mind, relating back to the idea that home isn't necessarily a place, but a psychological idea. Realism. Su Sin Far, The Wavering Image. Now it's all about, quote-unquote, life being at the center, capturing that harsh reality, class conflict, and liminal spaces in realism and Farr's work. Throughout her life, Farr encountered cultural and racial barriers where she, quote, struggled to retain her sense of biracial and bicultural identity, that liminal space, where society could only see her as being Chinese or quote-unquote white, but not both. Pan, the main character in The Wavering Image, experiences a similar situation, where in the city she's seen as being Chinese, but for Mark Carson, the other character in the short story, to love her, she must be seen as white. So with life being at the center, how society perceives her now plays a major role, as it isn't just necessarily about the self, it's what we see versus what it is. Modernism. William Carlos Williams, The Young Housewife. Considering that two major themes of modernism are fragmentation and alienation, it's no surprise that the idea of being unhomed pops up. So in The Young Housewife, William writes, quote, the wooden walls of her husband's house, end quote. So yes, we do have that literal imagery of a home, where we think of a home or a house as a shelter, this safe and stable place. But it's careful that we note his description of the walls as being wooden. A wooden wall versus a brick wall per se can be penetrated more easily. It's a lesser sound structure. So not only that, but it's the husband's house. It's possessive, specifically the husband's house. So not only is the housewife living in an unstable home, it's not truly her home, but her husband's. So once again, we're seeing, just how because we place ourselves into these structures, it doesn't necessarily mean that we feel homed. Contemporary fiction. Sherman Alexie, What You Pawn, I Will Redeem. Themes of disintegration, instability, and isolation dominate contemporary fiction. As described by Bolesco, quote, Alexi's abiding interest in the everyday experiences of Native Americans, keen ear for dialogue, and his sardonic humor was singled out. What You Pawn, I Will Redeem represents one of the most ironic examples of being unhomed, as the main character is a displaced, homeless Native American, the very people indigenous to the land. So, as taken from 10 Little Indians, quote, Alexi follows his man through his world not as a character but as a human being, end quote. This careful development of his character, Jackson in What You Pawn I Will Redeem, as the quote-unquote anti-hero, is what allows us to hear that unhomed voice. It's Fetter, Holmes, and Jardin. That idea of fitting ourselves into structures to achieve that American dream of being homed, yet the American voice of feeling unhomed. So sure, unhomed can refer to being physically displaced, like the Native Americans referenced in Alexi's What You Pawn I Will Redeem, but more frequently we see that mental displacement, fragmentation, isolation of being unhomed psychologically. Like what many of my friends said in the opening interview, home isn't necessarily a place but an idea, despite the fact that we continue to attempt to fit ourselves into these constraining structures. As Audre Lorde said, quote, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, end quote. Her idea of potency or power, strength, and confidence has to be developed out of some sort of struggle. Without a struggle, that problem, that catalyst, that motivation, you don't really have a reason or ability to ever evolve, adapt, innovate, even dismantle or destroy. So yes, the motivation behind it is most likely negative, but the feeling and action in response to the motivation doesn't necessarily have to be. Like in Aquano's The Interesting Narrative, his motivation to feeling unhomed is because of the slave trade. And clearly slavery is a negative motivation. But that uncomfortable, constraining, unhomed feeling is what inspires him to write his narrative and attempts to share that unsettling feeling and make people realize how inhumane slavery is as a practice. There's this irony of dreaming to be home, but we aren't. And would we really want to be? I mean, without that unhomed feeling, what would push us to improve and strive for greater things? I mean, after all, it inspired Aquano to write his narrative to make strides towards the abolition of slavery. But of course, that idea of feeling unhomed is only one angle, one dimension, one part of the American voice. Thanks for joining me on this episode. I'll catch you next time. Support for Fetter, Holmes, and Jardin goes out to Laura Norton. Without Laura, none of this would have been possible. And thank you to Mom, the person that bought me this mic to record my podcast. Thank you for tuning in.